Have you noticed that the most intelligent and reflective people you know seem to be increasingly withdrawing from the world? That they reply less to messages, avoid social gatherings, and would rather stay home reading a book than engage in empty conversations about the latest social media scandal? Maybe you yourself have felt this growing urgency to step back, to find silence in a world that seems to have forgotten what that word means. If you've experienced this feeling that wisdom and solitude are walking hand in hand, you're not imagining things. Something profound is happening in our society. Something that is pushing the most lucid thinkers of our time to seek refuge away from the collective noise we call modern civilization. This isn't the first time in human history that we've seen such a phenomenon. During the fall of the Roman Empire, as social structures collapsed and barbarism seemed to dominate the streets, many of the great thinkers of that time withdrew to monasteries and remote libraries. They weren't fleeing responsibility, they were preserving the flame of knowledge in times of intellectual darkness. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, wrote his deepest works precisely when he distanced himself from Rome's corrupt politics. Augustine found his highest truths when he abandoned worldly life and dedicated himself to contemplation. These men understood something our era seems to have forgotten, that true wisdom only flourishes in silence, far from the noise and haste that characterize periods of cultural decline. What we are witnessing today is a similar phenomenon, but amplified by technology. We live in an age where information has become noise, where communication has turned into constant chatter, and where deep reflection has been replaced by instant reactions. Social media has created an environment where superficial thinking is rewarded with likes and shares, while complex ideas and nuance are ignored or attacked. In this context, the most developed minds are doing what they've always done in times of turmoil, withdrawing to preserve their sanity and their ability to think clearly. But there's a fundamental difference between the isolation of the wise in the past and what we observe today. Previously, this withdrawal was temporary and necessary pause before returning with renewed insight to contribute to society. Today, however, many of our brightest thinkers are retreating permanently, not because they've chosen a path of spiritual contemplation, but because they've realized that our society has become fundamentally hostile to deep thinking and genuine wisdom. The internet, which should have democratized knowledge and elevated the level of public discourse, ended up doing the opposite. It created an environment where any opinion, regardless of its factual basis or depth of analysis, carries the same weight as decades of study and experience. A 16-word tweet can have more impact on public opinion than years of academic research. In this scenario, true experts and thinkers have discovered that their voices are not only ignored, but often attacked by virtual mobs that confuse knowledge with arrogance and expertise with elitism. The algorithm of digital platforms, designed to maximize engagement, systematically favors content that provokes immediate emotional reactions over content that invites slow reflection. Controversial statements and crude simplifications generate more clicks than careful analysis and balanced considerations. Consequently, the digital public space has become an environment where wisdom is not only undervalued, but actively discouraged. Algorithms have learned that anger and outrage keep people connected longer than contemplation and understanding. Faced with this reality, many intellectuals, artists, scientists, and thinkers have made a rational choice to withdraw. They realized that participating in this digital circus not only wastes their time and energy, but also compromises their intellectual integrity. It is impossible to maintain the depth of thought necessary for genuine insight when you are constantly reacting to current events, responding to misinformed criticism, or trying to explain complex ideas in formats designed for quick entertainment. This withdrawal is not just an individual issue, it is a collective phenomenon that is depriving our society of its most valuable minds precisely when we need them most. In an age of accelerated technological change, global environmental crises, and profound social transformations, we are losing those who could best help us navigate these challenges. The thinkers who could offer historical perspective, systemic analysis, and creative solutions are retreating to their studies, leaving the field open to charlatans, influencers, and opportunists who thrive in the fragmented attention span that defines our time. The paradox is cruel. The more complex our problems become, the more our culture rewards simple answers. The more nuance and sophistication we need, the more our society celebrates crudeness and simplicity, and the more we need wisdom, the more hostile we become toward those who possess it. It's as if we are actively creating the conditions for our own collective ignorance. But perhaps that is exactly what's happening. Perhaps we are living in an era where human society is undergoing a kind of reverse natural selection, where the traits that made us successful as a species, curiosity, the capacity for deep reflection, the pursuit of truth, are being systematically discouraged in favor of traits that promote immediate consumption and instant gratification. Consider how our educational institutions have changed in recent decades. Universities, which should be sanctuaries of free thought and rigorous inquiry, have increasingly turned into factories of ideological conformity and vocational training. The pressure for constant publication forces academics to produce quantity over quality. The need for funding obliges them to tailor the research to the interests of corporations or governments, and the culture of political correctness creates an environment where certain questions can't be asked and certain conclusions can't be reached, regardless of what the evidence may suggest. As a result, many of the most talented and principled researchers are leaving academia not because they've lost interest in knowledge, but because they've realized that the institutions meant to nurture that interest have become obstacles to their pursuit. They are creating their own independent spaces, writing books instead of papers, producing podcasts instead of attending conferences, and building small, curated communities instead of trying to reform corrupted institutions. This fragmentation of knowledge has deep consequences for our society. When the wise withdraw, they take with them not only their discoveries and insights, but also their ability to teach and inspire others. Wisdom, unlike information, cannot simply be transmitted through texts or videos. It must be cultivated through relationships, mentorship, and lived example. When those relationships are severed, we lose not only current knowledge, but also the ability to generate future knowledge. But there is an even deeper irony in this process. By isolating themselves, the wise may be inadvertently accelerating the very process that led them to withdraw in the first place. Their absence from public discourse leaves a vacuum quickly filled by less qualified voices, but more willing to participate in the media circus. This, in turn, further degrades the quality of public discourse, creating a vicious cycle where wisdom becomes even more alienated and irrelevant. And perhaps that's exactly what certain forces in our society want. An informed and reflective population is harder to manipulate than a distracted and emotional crowd. Citizens who think deeply about policy consequences are more likely to question convenient narratives than those who react instinctively to sensational headlines. A democracy of wise people is less predictable and controllable than a mass of anxious consumers. From this perspective, the isolation of the wise is not just an emerging cultural phenomenon, it is a feature of the system we are building. A system that favors consumption over contemplation, reaction over reflection, and conformity over creativity. A system where wisdom is not just irrelevant, but potentially dangerous to those who benefit from maintaining the status quo. So what should we do in the face of this situation? As individuals who value deep thinking and the search for truth, how should we respond to a world that seems to have lost interest in these things? The answer is not simple, and certainly not one size fits all. Some may argue that we must resist, that we must stay in the public space and fight to raise the level of discourse, even if it means facing constant attacks and distortions of our ideas. This is a noble stance, and there have certainly been times in history when such resistance was necessary and effective. But there are also times when direct resistance is futile, when energy is better spent preserving and cultivating wisdom in protected spaces, waiting for more favorable times. Others may suggest that we should adapt our communication to new media, that we should learn to convey complex ideas in simple formats, that we should use the tools of the digital age to spread wisdom instead of fleeing from it. This is also a valid approach, and some thinkers have managed to do so successfully. But there is a real risk that in adapting the message to the medium, we may inadvertently corrupt the very wisdom we're trying to transmit. A third option is to accept that our era may not be ready for certain forms of wisdom, and that our responsibility is to preserve it for future generations. Just as medieval monks preserved classical texts during the Dark Ages, perhaps our role is to keep the tradition of deep thinking alive during this age of digital superficiality, trusting that eventually there will be a rediscovery and a rebirth. I want to pause for a moment to ask, do you also feel this tension between the need to retreat in order to preserve your intellectual sanity and the desire to contribute to a world that seems desperately in need of more wisdom? This feeling that in order to maintain your integrity of thought, you need to withdraw precisely from the spaces where that integrity would be most needed? I know many of us carry this dilemma in silence, perhaps out of fear of sounding arrogant or elitist. But this conflict is real and valid. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, "I feel the need to isolate when," filling in with your personal experience. Your honesty may help others realize they are not alone in this struggle between engagement and preservation. Perhaps the answer is not to choose between these options, but to find a way to integrate them. Maybe we can create distributed networks of wisdom, small communities that are connected yet independent, that maintain intellectual depth while remaining selectively and strategically engaged with the wider world. Maybe we can develop new models of influence that don't depend on participating in systems that corrupt what we're trying to preserve. The same technology that created our current problems might also offer solutions. Decentralized platforms could allow direct communication between like-minded minds without the intermediation of commercial algorithms. Artificial intelligence tools might help filter out the noise and identify truly valuable content. New economic models might sustain independent thinkers without forcing them to submit to the pressures of the attention market. But in the end, perhaps the most important question is not how the wise can return to the public space, but how the rest of us can join them in the cultivation of wisdom. Maybe instead of lamenting the isolation of thinkers, we should ask why the rest of society has settled for superficiality. Maybe instead of criticizing those who have withdrawn, we should ask how we can create a culture that once again values depth over speed, reflection over reaction, and wisdom over information. The truth is, we all have a choice to make. We can continue participating in a system that rewards mediocrity and punishes intellectual excellence, or we can begin to build alternatives. We can accept that we live in a time of cultural decline, or we can work to create pockets of resistance where the tradition of wisdom can survive and eventually flourish again. This choice is not just personal, it is civilizational. The future of humanity may well depend on our ability to recognize and reverse the current trend of marginalizing wisdom. If we continue down the present path, where the most thoughtful and informed voices are systematically silenced or forced into isolation, we may find ourselves in a society where no one remembers how to think deeply about the problems we face. But if we can recognize the value of what we are losing, if we can create spaces where wisdom is once again valued and cultivated, then perhaps we can not only avoid that fate, but build something better than what we had before. A society where technology serves wisdom instead of replacing it, where communication facilitates understanding instead of obstructing it, and where the wisest among us are celebrated instead of marginalized. The final question is, which side of history do we want to be on? The side of those who passively accepted the cultural degradation of our era, or the side of those who worked to preserve and transmit the best of human thought? The side of those who settled for shallow entertainment? Or the side of those who insisted we deserve something deeper and more meaningful? The choice is ours, and the time to make it is running out. The wise are withdrawing not because they've lost hope in humanity, but because they're waiting for the rest of us to join them in the search for something better. The question is, will we rise to that expectation, or will we allow the wisdom of our species to retreat for good into the shadows of history? If these reflections touched something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you are not alone. This channel exists so we can explore together these deep questions that define our time, to seek not only understanding, but wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. Each week, we meet here to examine the great questions of our age, not with simple answers or easy solutions, but with the intellectual honesty these themes deserve. If you want to be part of this community of people who refuse to accept superficiality as the inevitable fate of our civilization, subscribe to the channel. Together, perhaps we can create the kind of space where wisdom no longer needs to hide, but can once again illuminate the path toward a more reflective and human future. Process of change. And I sometimes think about history maybe as a kind of collective therapy.